Okay, welcome back. This is Dave King. We're going to go ahead and go through a simple design process for a molar crown. I'm going to walk you through the process. So, first thing we want to do at this screen, make sure you've got everything set up correctly. Select a single restoration. We're going to do a crown on tooth number 15. And I don't have any biocopy information. I don't want to do reference, so I'm going to do biogeneric individual. And then we're going to select the materials. We're going to use Emax, which is an Ivoclar Vivadent product. And then we'll go ahead and select the tooth. So at this point, I'm going to roll over to tooth number 15. And I could, if I wanted to, activate this smile design, or if I go back in the settings, I could turn on the articulation function. But we're just going to do a standard crown. Now at this point, one thing to mention to you, if I wanted to, I could edit this restoration right here. By clicking the edit button, and then I could change what type of design mode we're using. I could change the materials. I could even change the milling device if we had multiple milling units. I could also delete it. So if I go through and I want to do an Emax here and an Empress crown here, then I'll go back over here. I'm going to edit this now to reflect Empress, and then I'll add tooth number 14. Now I know we're only doing 15 right now, but here you can see 14 populates as an Empress crown, 15 as an Emax. Now if I wanted to edit number 15 to be an Empress crown, I can't go over here to edit 15. I have to actually go over here, click on 15, and then edit it. Then I can go in here and change it to an Empress crown if I want to. I'm not going to do that, however. I'm going to go ahead and delete tooth number 14 because we're only working on number 15. So I'm going to hit delete, and then I'm going to go next. Now I've already taken the images for this restoration, and it's a Typodont case, so it's nothing groundbreaking. Pretty routine stuff. One of the other videos we'll talk about imaging. This is the opposing arch. Here is the upper arch. This is not my prep, but it's a very nice prep with a retention groove in there, and the buccal scan. Alright, so these are pretty clear images, nice, clear, crisp images. That's one of the goals we want to focus on with our imaging, is to make sure they're high quality images. Alright, so let's hit next. Our first step is to draw the margin. Now we've already, of course, identified in our preparation phase where the margin is, but now we just want to tell the computer where that is. So, first thing to bear in mind is you want to double click to start, and you'll notice it defaults to the automatic margin finding setup. There are some docs that like to go all the way around and outline the margin with the auto margin finder. Personally, I prefer to do it mostly by myself, so I'll hit spacebar to bring it to manual margin mode, and you can see that line turns white. If I hit the space bar again, it'll go back to the automatic margin finding. But I prefer to use the manual mode. It seems to me to be a little simpler. So click, and as you click, the computer's going to automatically curve the lines for us. If I make a mistake, if I'm out here too far and I want to undo it, you just right click right here, and it'll undo your margin. Alright, so single clicks to capture where that margin is. It's a little difficult to see because we've got a white background and a white margin line. But I'm going to go ahead and outline the margin here. Now one thing to bear in mind, you see how I double click to finish, is whenever you're in doubt, always take the margin wider than you think it needs to be. Now this is not perfect, so I'm going to go back and edit this. I'm going to double click where I want to start the edit, and then work my way back around to where the margin is. Double click and get to the point where I'm comfortable with that margin. But always remember, you're better off having too much margin that you can trim off in the post-mill processing phase or after you bond it in the mouth than you are having not enough margin and having to trim the tooth. I'd much rather sacrifice part of the new restoration than I would sacrifice the tooth itself if possible. Okay, so let's just assume we're 100% happy with that particular restoration, or that margination of the crown. You'll notice as I zoom in that margin line becomes a lot thinner, and as we zoom back out, it kind of thickens up so that we can see a little more clearly as we're a distance away from it. Notice as well the way I'm positioning my hands. This works pretty well for me. Normally I use one finger on my left hand, and then my thumb here, and my fingers here. The right button, if you hold it down and roll, this will pan. In almost every screen, this will pan. The center button, if you press and hold, this will zoom. All right, and then this left button, which I'm going to use my left hand for, will roll and also select. So if I were to be on the margin, double click, it'll select, but it will roll the restoration. So just to recap, we've got a pan, a zoom in the middle, and a roll. All right? Okay, so let's say I'm happy with where this is, the margin, and the next thing we need to do is determine the insertion axis. So this becomes really critical when we're dealing with multiple restorations, with bridges, or with very tall preparations. You can see as I'm rolling it over, we're seeing some of this yellow. The yellow is where the computer is calculating undercut. So we want to be very careful with undercut, because that can create some issues for us with regard to the seat of the restoration. So generally I want you to line it up with no yellow if possible. Also, we want to make sure that we can see as much of this adjacent proximal contact as possible, so as to ensure that we can get a nice seat when we deliver the crown. Okay, next we'll go to this preparation analysis step. And you can see we're all green, a little bit of blue. Here's your key up here on the left. And you can see all this green is plenty of reduction. Here we're 1.7 or so. Looks like we have plenty of occlusal reduction, plenty of axial reduction. Shouldn't be an issue with regard to how this seats, or how much strength we have, how much thickness we have in the restoration. So the next thing we'll do is get a design. Now at this point, if you did get a proposal where there was too much, not enough reduction, I guess is what I'm trying to say, you can go back, rescan the restoration, and start again. And that's what I'd suggest you do. If there's not enough reduction, don't cut corners. Back up, lean the patient back, prep a little bit more, and then rescan. You don't want to compromise the longevity of the restoration. Okay, so here's our initial proposal. A couple of things to bear in mind. This blue is a minimal thickness warning. It does not absolutely mean it's too thin. This is a warning. So when we turn on our display options, the minimal thickness here is you can toggle on and off. And this is all based on what our parameters are. If our parameters are set to have this axial minimal thickness at 0.5 millimeters, then anything less than 0.5 is going to show up as being too thin. So let's take a look at what our parameters are down here. So spacer 200, this is dependent on your cement thickness. I usually leave mine up at the 200 level. It tends to be a little easier to seat. Occlusal milling offset, this happens after the machine mill, or after it's designed in the milling phase. This is not something that you can see in your design process. But watch this area as I alter that occlusal milling offset. See, the positive number increases the height of the offset, so it's going to mill it taller than you design it. And a negative number will mill it shorter than you design it. Normally we leave ours at about 200, maybe a little less, 150. That'll compensate for some cement thickness and for some periodontal ligament swelling during and after the process. Proximal contact strengths, this is only for proposal purposes. So what these three numbers here are only for initial proposal purposes. So once you hit design restoration, that's what determines, this setting is what determines what colors you're going to get with your initial proposal. So it doesn't really matter beyond the initial proposal. Some people want the computer to design it all and not to retouch it. I usually go back and retouch my contacts just a little bit. I like a little bit of yellow. Now I could certainly adjust that here, so there's a little bit of yellow like I like there, or I could just leave it where it was. Occlusal is the same way. This is for proposal purposes only. Dynamic contact strengths, this relates directly to the articulation function, which we're not going to talk about today. Minimal thickness radial, so we're at 1100 microns, 1.1 millimeters, which for me, that's a little much. I don't need that much reduction. We could go less than 1 millimeter there if I wanted to. I'm going to leave it at 1100 just for fun. Minimal thickness occlusal, 1.5. This is all dependent on your material. Now watch what happens. See, the blue is what I'm changing here. So this blue bubble is the warning that shows up through the restoration that we were looking at a moment ago. So if I increase this or decrease this, this will show more blue or less blue, and we can bulk out the restoration to hide that blue or remove it to show more blue. As long as you've reduced appropriately and you have the appropriate amount of axial and occlusal reduction, this number is not really crucial, but you want to make sure that you verify that you're well within the manufacturer recommendations with regard to how much you've reduced. So I'm going to hit cancel. We're not going to change any of these. I'm going to go back to edit so you can see this little bit of blue here, and I'm going to increase the translucence of the restoration. So you can see that blue bubble, the minimal thickness bubble. So you can see we're a little bit outside that blue bubble here. And again, that was set, if we look at our parameters, we set it at 1100 microns, which is, again, that's a little bit more than you need. So we could actually ignore this. Now if I click this off, the minimal thickness, you can now see through the restoration and see where this area is thick. All right, and we could actually go in here if we wanted to and use our distance tool and measure that. You know, and this is a little bit off. It's a little bit angular. Depending on where I click, it may not necessarily work well. So that's one tool you can use. You can also use the cursor details. So wherever the cursor is, as I roll up here, that'll tell me my thickness. See that number is rolling up and changing. There's going to hop way up as I'm down in that groove. And as we go over the occlusal, our height and our fissure height, thickness, plenty of reduction here. You know, depending on what you want for reduction, it looks like we have plenty of reduction there. You can actually leave this on while you're designing your restoration. The cursor details is kind of a helpful guide, but it could get in the way and just take up screen space. So I'm going to turn my minimal thickness back on. And one thing I will mention to you is oftentimes if you've turned this off for one restoration and you've gone forward and milled the whole finished the whole restoration process, and you go back to another restoration, this defaults to being off if you've left it off. So make sure that you double check before you mill that restoration. You double check that your minimal thickness is on so that you can see where those thin spots may be, areas that you may need to alter. So for me, with the restoration parameter set at 1100 microns and seeing this, I'm okay with that. But it really depends on the material you're using, the minimal thickness of the ceramic, whether it's Emax or Empress or whatever it is. And then also what you prefer is the minimal thickness and how much has been reduced. So if that's an occlusal area with all that blue, I would be worried. We've got a little blue spot pinpoint here, which I'll edit here in just a second. But we want to be very cautious that we follow the manufacturer's directions and instructions with regard to minimal thickness. So let's talk about editing. So a couple of things I will mention to you first is we want to start editing from big to small. You don't want to start doing fine detail and nuance editing at this stage. The first thing we want to do is edit big to small. So we want to look at where the restoration is positioned in relation to the rest of the arch. So for me, the positioning is pretty good. But just for the fun of it, let's say we wanted to move the restoration around. So a couple of ways we can do that. If you want a whole lot of control, one of the nice features of the new software version is this bio-jaw function, which is really an advanced function we're not going to talk about now in the introductory series, but it is something that is a great tool for us, which gives us complete control over the design and the shape and the position with very little computer input. I would leave that alone for now. We'll get to that in one of the advanced phases. If you want to move this restoration around, a couple of things for you to consider. I'm going to close these windows so we have more space. There are two ways to get to your tools. Over here on the right side, you can click and see your tools here. The Move tool is what I would suggest starting with if you need to. So when you click on that, it gives you, rotational, axial, buccal, lingual, distal, all that rotational ability, and also positioning. So I could move the restoration up and down. Another way to get to that tool is to right click. So I'm using the right click button over the restoration. I'll show you that again. The right click over the restoration gives you the same tools here as there are here, with the exception of that one and that one. The same tools, right? So generally speaking, you've got all these tools that you can use, you can get to by right-clicking, okay? So positioning, if you want to, what I'd suggest is grab in two ways. So if you want to move, buccal to lingual, you can see how the arrow is highlighted. Mesial to distal, the arrow is highlighted there. If you want to be able to move in all four directions, you grab the center square, right? And then you position it wherever you want it. And then if you want to, we can go ahead and rotate it. If you're not happy with how it is, you can rotate it, buccal to lingual, match those cusp heights, make sure the tooth matches the buccal corridor and the palatal corridor. We want to make sure that the tooth is aligned appropriately.